kidding.
You won't say a church, you reckon? You can't just tear down my home. This is illegal.
They sued me for destroying my own property. Imagine this. An HOA illegally builds a $200,000 luxury cabin right on top of your family's sacred land, covering even your grandfather's memorial stone, and then has the audacity to sue you for $750,000 when you demolish it. That's exactly what happened to me. But here's the twist. When I dug deeper, I found forged documents and impossible signatures that turned this entire scheme into something far bigger and darker than just a property dispute. Before I start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? They sued me for destroying my own property. HOA built a $200,000 cabin on my family's land without permission. When I demolished it, the HOA hit me with a $750,000 lawsuit claiming I destroyed their legal construction. But here's what's insane. They had documents with signatures that should have been impossible to obtain. How did they get paperwork that didn't exist? Comment your state. You need to hear this twisted scheme. Look, I've dealt with difficult neighbors before, but what I discovered that Tuesday morning in September 2025 felt different. Like when you're walking alone at night and suddenly realize someone's been following you. I was doing my usual property inspection with my trusty ATV, something I'd been putting off for 2 months because work had been absolutely insane. My grandfather, Daniel Palmer, established this land back in 1952, and I inherited it when he passed in 1989. The guy was a simple farmer who carved every fence post by hand and treated this mountain property like it was sacred ground. His memorial stone, which he'd carved himself with the words, "Palmer Family Land Forever," had always been the centerpiece of our small family cemetery area. But when I rounded the bend where that stone should have been visible, my brain did that thing where it tries to process information that doesn't make sense. There was a cabin. Not just any cabin, but a luxury structure that looked like it belonged in some mountain resort magazine, complete with a stone fireplace, wraparound deck, and windows that probably cost more than my truck. I sat there on my ATV for probably 5 full minutes, just staring. The cabin was positioned exactly where my grandfather's memorial stone should be visible, almost like someone had deliberately chosen that spot to hide our family history. My hands were literally shaking as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates and timestamp on every shot. This wasn't some mistake or property line confusion. This was a professionally built structure, complete with electrical hookups and a paved access road that definitely hadn't been there during my last inspection. The positioning was too perfect, too deliberate. Someone had researched our property, identified the most meaningful spot to our family, and built right on top of it. Jake Morrison, my best friend since high school, and the guy who had helped me maintain this land for years, had always joked that someone would try to steal it eventually. Dude, he'd said just last month, mountain property like this is like having a winning lottery ticket. Somebody's always going to want what you got, but I never imagined it would be this blatant, this calculated, this personal. When I finally worked up the nerve to approach the cabin, I felt like I was trespassing on my own land. The structure was gorgeous. I'll give them that. River rock foundation, hand-honeyed log construction, copper gutters that probably cost more than most people's cars. But gorgeous or not, it was sitting on sacred family ground without my permission. As I was documenting everything with my phone, trying to figure out what kind of legal nightmare I was walking into, I heard a car engine behind me. Not just any car, but the kind of expensive SUV that screams, "I have money, and I'm not afraid to use it in court." The door slammed with authority, and out stepped a woman in her early 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident stride that usually comes with either supreme innocence or supreme guilt. She was carrying a leather briefcase thick as a Bible and wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Palmer," she said, and the fact that she knew my name sent chills down my spine. "I'm Claire Jenkins, president of the Elk Ridge Heritage Council. We need to talk." The conversation that followed felt like being in some kind of alternate reality. Claire wasn't defensive or apologetic about the cabin. She was confident, professional, almost bored, like this was just another Tuesday for her. She handed me a stack of legal documents that made my head spin. Elk Ridge Heritage Council easement agreement, she explained, pointing to official-looking paperwork with seals and signatures. Signed by your grandfather, Daniel Palmer, on September 15, 1987. This grants our organization expansion rights on the designated portion of your property. I stared at the documents, and I have to admit, they looked legitimate. Professional letterhead, notary stamps, witness signatures, the whole 9 yards. But something felt wrong. My grandfather was a simple man who kept meticulous records of everything related to this land. He'd shown me every legal document, every deed, every tax record. There was no way he'd signed away family land without telling me, especially not land containing his own memorial stone. This doesn't make sense, I told Claire, my voice probably shaking more than I wanted it to. My grandfather would never agree to this. This land was his life's work. Claire's smile was the kind you see on politicians right before they drop bad news. Mr. Palmer, memory can be unreliable, especially when it comes to elderly relatives. Sometimes families forget important legal arrangements. The condescending tone in her voice made my hands clench into fists. But here's where things got really weird. As I was examining the signature on the easement document, trying to figure out if it looked like my grandfather's handwriting, my phone rang. Rebecca, my wife and the smartest person I know, was calling from her office downtown. "Greg, how's the property inspection going?" she asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice, even through the phone. Rebecca had been a legal assistant for 15 years before she burned out on the Denver law firm scene, and she had this incredible ability to smell legal trouble from miles away. "Honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while Claire stood there listening to every word. "We have a situation, a big one." I quickly explained about the cabin and the easement documents, and I could practically hear Rebecca's lawyer brain kicking into high gear. "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't let them intimidate you," she said firmly. "I'm leaving work now. Take pictures of everything. Get GPS coordinates, Zorg ordinates, and for God's sake, don't let them know we're preparing to fight this." After I hung up, Claire was still standing there with that same confident smile. "Your wife sounds like a smart woman," she said. "I hope she understands that fighting this would be very expensive and, ultimately, futile. We have all the proper documentation." There was something about the way she said proper documentation that made my skin crawl. That evening, Rebecca and I spread all our family documents across our kitchen table like we were planning some kind of military operation. Birth certificates, property deeds, tax records, family photos, anything that might give us clues about this supposed easement agreement. Rebecca had that focused expression she gets when she's solving complex problems, the same look she used to have when she was untangling complicated legal cases for her old firm. "Greg," she said after about an hour of examining everything, "I need you to look at something." She held up 2 documents side by side. One was the easement agreement with my grandfather's signature dated September 15, 1987. The other was his actual will, signed just months before his death in 1989. The handwriting was completely different. The easement signature was steady, confident, and clearly from someone with strong hands and good muscle control. The will signature was shaky, uncertain, obviously from an elderly man with arthritis and failing health. "Rebecca," I whispered, staring at the evidence in front of us. If someone forged Grandpa's name using a signature from when he was younger and healthier, how did they know exactly how he signed documents 30 years ago? The next morning, instead of producing more paperwork like I expected, Claire Jenkins called me with a proposition that should have set off every alarm bell in my head. "Mr. Emmy Palmer," she said in that same professionally confident tone, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our easement agreement. Rather than argue over documents, why don't I show you the actual historical evidence on your property?" I think once you see the archaeological significance of the cabin site, you'll understand why this land requires heritage protection. Something about the way she phrased it made my skin crawl, but Rebecca encouraged me to go. If she's lying, Rebecca said, seeing her in action might reveal how she operates, and if she's telling the truth. She paused, looking at the forensic analysis Dr. Cooper had provided. Well, we need to understand what we're really dealing with. So I agreed to meet Claire at the property that afternoon, bringing Jake Morrison along as a witness and my phone ready to record everything. When Claire arrived at the cabin site, she wasn't alone. She'd brought someone she introduced as Dr. Michael Stevens, an archaeologist who supposedly specialized in Native American historical sites in Colorado. The guy looked the part. I'll give him that. Khaki field clothes, professional equipment, and the kind of confident academic demeanor that made you want to believe everything he said. But something felt off about the whole setup. Dr. Stevens immediately started pointing out what he claimed were clear indicators of historical significance around the cabin foundation. "See these stone arrangements?" he said, gesturing to what looked like randomly placed rocks. "These are remnants of traditional fire circles used by indigenous peoples for ceremonial purposes. And these indentations in the soil indicate long-term habitation patterns." Jake and I exchanged glances because we'd both been on this property hundreds of times over the years, and neither of us had ever noticed anything that looked remotely like archaeological artifacts. But Dr. Stevens wasn't finished with his performance. He pulled out what appeared to be authentic arrowheads and pottery fragments, claiming he had found them during his preliminary survey of the area just that morning. "Mr. Palmer," he said with the kind of grave authority that academics use when they want to make you feel ignorant, "this site represents one of the most significant, undisturbed Native American ceremonial locations in this region. The cabin was positioned specifically to protect these artifacts from weather damage and unauthorized excavation. The whole presentation was incredibly convincing, and I could see how most people would be completely taken in by the professional setup." Claire stood nearby with a satisfied expression, occasionally nodding as Dr. Stevens explained the cultural significance of various features around the cabin. But Jake, who'd grown up hunting and fishing on these mountains, whispered something to me that made everything click into place. "Dude, those arrowheads are machine-made replicas. You can buy them at any tourist shop in Denver." That's when I started paying closer attention to the details of Dr. Stevens's archaeological evidence. And the more I looked, the more obvious it became that this was an elaborate fraud. The ancient fire circles were made from stones that still had mortar residue from recent construction projects. The pottery fragments had perfectly clean break patterns that suggested they'd been deliberately broken from modern reproductions rather than naturally weathered over centuries. Most damning of all, the ceremonial site that Stevens claimed had been used for generations was positioned in an area that would have been underwater during spring snowmelt every year, making long-term habitation impossible. When I pointed out these inconsistencies, Dr. Stevens became defensive and started using technical jargon to deflect my questions. "Mr. Palmer," he said with barely concealed irritation, "archaeological interpretation requires years of specialized training. These site characteristics may not be obvious to untrained observers, but they're quite clear to professionals with appropriate expertise." Claire's response to my skepticism revealed another layer of her manipulation strategy. Instead of defending Dr. Stevens or trying to convince me of the archaeological evidence, she smoothly transitioned to what she called environmental concerns about disturbing the site. "Gregory," she said, using my first name for the first time to create false intimacy. "Even if you question the historical significance, surely you can understand the environmental importance of preserving this ecosystem. The cabin provides weather protection for the soil composition and prevents erosion that could damage the entire watershed." It was like watching a master manipulator adapt her strategy in real time. When the archaeological angle didn't work, she immediately pivoted to environmental protection, complete with technical-sounding explanations about soil stability and watershed management. But her environmental claims were just as fabricated as the archaeological evidence. The cabin's foundation was actually causing erosion by channeling rainwater in unnatural patterns, and the construction had destroyed several mature trees that were genuinely important to the local ecosystem. The turning point came when Jake decided to test Dr. Stevens's credentials by asking specific questions about Colorado archaeology that anyone with real expertise would know. "Dr. Stevens," Jake said with the kind of innocent curiosity that made his trap perfect. "What's your opinion on the recent discoveries at the Linen-Myers site? I heard they're changing our understanding of Folsom culture in this region." Dr. Stevens' response was exactly what Jake had been hoping for. Confused bluffing and vague generalizations that proved he had no real knowledge of Colorado archaeology. The Linen-Myers site was a famous archaeological location that any legitimate expert would know intimately, but Stevens clearly had no idea what Jake was talking about. When Jake pressed for more specific details about Folsom Point technology and dating methods, Stevens excused himself to take a phone call and never returned to finish the conversation. But the discovery that really exposed Claire's deception came when I noticed something she didn't realize I'd seen. While Dr. Stevens was giving his performance about ceremonial fire circles, Claire's purse had fallen over, spilling its contents on the ground. As she quickly gathered everything up, I caught a glimpse of documents that made my blood run cold. Photocopies of my grandfather's original property deeds, his military service records, and even personal letters he'd written during World War II. These weren't public records that anyone could access through normal channels. These were private family documents that should have been impossible for Claire to obtain unless she'd somehow gained access to our family's personal papers or had connections within government agencies that maintained historical military records. The implications were terrifying. Claire hadn't just targeted our property randomly. She'd been researching my family for months or possibly years, gathering intimate details about our history to use against us. When I confronted Claire about the documents, her mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something that scared me more than all her previous confidence and manipulation. She looked genuinely surprised that I'd noticed the papers, which suggested she'd become so comfortable with her operation that she was getting careless. But her recovery was immediate and chilling. "Mr. Palmer," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "thorough research is essential for heritage preservation work. We need to understand the complete historical context of any property before we can properly protect its cultural significance." The casual way she admitted to researching my family's private history was like listening to a predator explain hunting techniques. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she'd invaded our privacy. She was presenting it as professional diligence. That evening, as Rebecca and I tried to process what we'd learned, one question kept haunting me. If Claire had access to my grandfather's military records and personal correspondence from the 1940s, what other information had she gathered about our family? Dr. Cooper had suggested that creating the sophisticated signature forgery would require multiple handwriting samples from different decades of my grandfather's life. But seeing those documents in Claire's purse made me realize the scope of her research was far beyond anything we'd imagined. She didn't just have a few signatures to copy, she had access to decades of my grandfather's personal history, including details that even I didn't know about his military service and early life. But here's what kept me awake that night. If someone with Claire's resources and connections was willing to go to these lengths to steal our property, what would she be willing to do to people who stood in her way? Dr. Cooper had warned us that we were dealing with a sophisticated, criminal operation. But I was beginning to understand that we might be facing something far more dangerous than simple fraud. Who else would have access to 40-year-old military records and personal correspondence? Demolition Day arrived with more drama than I could have imagined, but not the kind Claire had orchestrated the first time around. Instead of hiring fake protesters, she'd apparently decided to take a more sophisticated approach to stopping us. As Jake and I were setting up our equipment with Deputy Morgan supervising, an official-looking van pulled up with Colorado Environmental Assessment painted on the side. Out stepped a woman in a professional field suit carrying what appeared to be legitimate geological surveying equipment. Claire introduced her as Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geologist supposedly sent by the State Environmental Office to conduct an emergency assessment of the demolition site. "Gentlemen," Dr. Walsh announced, with the kind of bureaucratic authority that immediately makes you nervous, "I'm here to evaluate potential environmental hazards before any demolition proceeds. We've received reports that this structure may be providing critical soil stabilization in an area prone to landslides." The whole setup was incredibly convincing, and I could see how anyone without a reason to be suspicious would have been completely fooled. Dr. Walsh had professional credentials, official-looking paperwork, and even a state vehicle that appeared legitimate. She immediately began conducting what looked like real geological surveys, taking soil samples, measuring gradients, and using equipment that seemed far too expensive for someone running a scam. "Mr. Palmer," she explained with scientific authority, "preliminary soil analysis indicates that this cabin's foundation is providing essential stabilization for what appears to be a historically unstable slope. Removing this structure without proper engineering analysis could trigger a landslide that would threaten structures downhill, including residential areas." But Jake, who'd worked construction in these mountains for 15 years, started asking questions that revealed problems with Dr. Walsh's supposed expertise. "Dr. Walsh," Jake said with the kind of respectful curiosity that made his skepticism less obvious, "I'm curious about your soil composition analysis. This area is primarily decomposed granite with excellent drainage characteristics. What specific geological factors are you seeing that would indicate landslide risk?" Dr. Walsh's response was textbook deflection. Lots of technical jargon about subsurface moisture retention patterns and fractured bedrock instability, but nothing that actually addressed Jake's specific question. When Jake pressed for more details about the geological survey methods she was using, Dr. Walsh became defensive and started lecturing us about the dangers of unqualified individuals questioning professional environmental assessments. But her credibility took a major hit when Jake pointed out that she was using a soil pH meter to supposedly measure geological stability, equipment that had nothing to do with landslide risk assessment. The turning point came when Deputy Morgan decided to verify Dr. Walsh's credentials by calling the State Environmental Office directly. I watched Claire's expression change from confident to concerned as the deputy spent 10 minutes on the phone with various State Department. "Ma'am," Deputy Morgan finally said to Dr. Walsh, "I've just spoken with the Colorado Environmental Assessment Division, and they have no record of dispatching anyone to this location. They also informed me that Dr. Jennifer Walsh is not currently employed by any state environmental agency." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Walsh started gathering her equipment with obvious nervousness, while Claire maintained her poker face. But I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes as she realized this particular deception had failed. But Claire's response to being caught red-handed with a fake expert revealed just how prepared she was for contingencies. Instead of panicking or making excuses, she immediately shifted to what appeared to be a backup plan. "Officer," she said with renewed confidence, "there seems to be some confusion about Dr. Walsh's credentials, but that doesn't change the underlying environmental concerns about this demolition. As a concerned community member, I have the right to request proper environmental review before any potentially dangerous construction activities proceed." She pulled out her phone and started making calls to what she claimed were county environmental officials, demanding immediate review of our demolition permits. Within 30 minutes, she'd managed to create enough bureaucratic confusion that Deputy Morgan had to halt the demolition until the various agencies could sort out their jurisdictions and requirements. What made this particularly frustrating was watching Claire turn her failed deception into a successful delay tactic. Even though Dr. Walsh had been exposed as a fraud, Claire managed to use the incident to raise legitimate questions about environmental oversight that required official review. She'd transformed being caught in a lie into grounds for stopping our legal demolition. And she did it with such professional skill that I could see how she'd probably use similar techniques to manipulate other families. "Mr. Palmer," she said with that same confident smile, "I hope you understand that community safety must take precedence over personal property disputes. I'm sure once the proper environmental assessments are completed, we can resolve this situation in a way that protects everyone's interests." But the discovery that really revealed Claire's level of sophistication came when Jake noticed something suspicious about the state environmental van that Dr. Walsh had arrived in. The vehicle had official-looking decals and license plates, but when Jake examined it more closely, he realized the government plates were clever forgeries. The fonts were slightly wrong. The numbering system didn't match legitimate state vehicles. And most damning of all, the vehicle identification number had been partially obscured with what appeared to be deliberate damage. "Greg," Jake whispered to me while Claire was distracted with her phone calls, "this isn't just document fraud anymore. She's running a sophisticated operation with fake vehicles, forged credentials, and professional accomplices. This is organized crime-level stuff." The implications hit me like a freight train. Claire wasn't just some ambitious HOA president trying to grab a piece of property. She was operating at a level that suggested serious financial backing, professional criminal connections, and resources that went far beyond what any individual could accomplish alone. The fake environmental expert, the forged government vehicle, the sophisticated documentation. All of it pointed to someone with access to criminal networks that specialized in this type of fraud. But what scared me most was realizing that if Claire was willing to impersonate state officials and forge government vehicles, there probably wasn't any limit to what she'd do to protect her operation. Deputy Morgan seemed to be thinking along similar lines because he spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls to various law enforcement agencies and taking detailed photographs of the fake environmental equipment. That evening, as Rebecca and I discussed the day's events, she made a connection that chilled me to the bone. "Greg," she said, pulling up news articles on her laptop, "I've been researching similar environmental fraud cases, and there's a pattern. Criminal organizations are using fake environmental concerns to stop legitimate property development, then manipulating the resulting legal delays to acquire properties through fraudulent means. It's happening in 6 different states, and the techniques are almost identical to what Claire used today." The scope of what we were dealing with was becoming clear. Claire wasn't just targeting our family randomly. She was part of a network that had systematized the process of stealing inherited property using environmental protection as cover. But the question that kept me awake that night was whether Claire's fake expert gambit had been improvised or planned. Had she always intended to use environmental manipulation as a backup strategy? Or was this her response to being caught with forged historical documents? Either way, it demonstrated a level of preparation and adaptability that suggested we were dealing with someone far more dangerous than we'd initially realized. When Deputy Morgan called me the next morning, his news confirmed my worst fears. "Mr. Palmer, I've been in touch with federal investigators about the fake government vehicle incident. They want to meet with you because your case might be connected to a larger investigation they've been conducting into organized inheritance fraud. How many other families don't know their ancestors' graves have been buried under illegal buildings?" The breakthrough that changed everything came not from another confrontation with Claire, but from Mark Jenkins finally finding the courage to dig deeper into his wife's computer files. While Claire was attending what she claimed was a heritage preservation conference in Denver, Mark discovered a hidden folder that revealed the true scope of her operation. What he found wasn't just evidence of property fraud. It was a digital warfare campaign that had been targeting our family and others for months. Claire had created dozens of fake social media accounts, each with carefully constructed identities and backstories designed to manipulate public opinion and generate artificial support for her projects. The level of sophistication was breathtaking. Fake Facebook profiles with years of posted content, Twitter accounts that appeared to belong to longtime Colorado residents, and even Instagram accounts documenting fake environmental activism in our area. But the discovery that made Mark physically sick was finding detailed psychological profiles Claire had created for each member of our family. She'd been monitoring our social media accounts, tracking our daily routines, and documenting our financial situation with the thoroughness of a professional stalker. The file labeled Palmer Family Vulnerability Assessment contained information that should have been impossible for her to obtain. My work schedule, Rebecca's exercise routine, our monthly expenses, even details about our marriage that she could only have learned through electronic surveillance or social engineering. She had identified what she called our pressure points, the specific stresses and concerns that could be exploited to make us more likely to give up our legal fight. The clinical coldness of reducing our family to data points for manipulation made Mark realize he'd been living with someone fundamentally inhuman. The fake social media campaign Claire had orchestrated was like something out of a political dirty tricks playbook. She'd created fictitious community members who posted regular comments supporting her environmental protection efforts and criticizing our family for threatening local wildlife habitats. These fake accounts would comment on each other's posts to create the illusion of genuine community discussion, share articles about environmental protection that made our demolition seem irresponsible, and even organize fake online petitions supporting Claire's position. But the most insidious part of her digital manipulation was how she'd used these fake accounts to gather intelligence about our family and supporters. Several of the fake profiles had sent friend requests to Rebecca and me, gaining access to our personal posts and photos that Claire then analyzed for information about our daily lives and emotional state. Mark's discovery of Claire's communication with what appeared to be a network of similar operations in other states revealed that our family was just one target in a much larger criminal enterprise. She had been participating in regular video conferences with other operatives, discussing best practices for property acquisition, sharing techniques for psychological manipulation, and coordinating strategies for dealing with resistant families who fought back against fraudulent claims. The conversations Mark recorded were like listening to predators comparing hunting techniques. Claire would describe our family's specific vulnerabilities and receive advice from other criminals about how to exploit them more effectively. The Palmer family has strong family loyalty and emotional attachment to the property. She explained in one recorded call, "Standard financial pressure won't be sufficient. We need to attack their sense of family legacy and create doubt about their grandfather's true intentions." But the evidence that finally pushed Mark from horrified observer to active whistleblower was discovering Claire's detailed timeline for our destruction. She'd calculated exactly how long our savings would last during extended litigation, identified the specific events that would cause us maximum emotional distress, and planned a coordinated campaign designed to break our resistance within 18 months. The document read like a military operation plan. Month 3. Initiate environmental violations that require expensive remediation. Month 6. Challenge property tax assessments to create additional financial pressure. Month 9. Begin psychological pressure campaign targeting marriage stability. Month 12. Offer settlement that appears generous but represents a fraction of property value. She'd even included psychological research about how trauma affects decision-making and the optimal timing for presenting reasonable settlement offers to families under extreme stress. The technology Claire was using for surveillance and manipulation was far beyond what most people would expect from a small-town criminal. Mark found evidence that she'd purchased professional-grade social media monitoring software, had access to data brokers who sold personal information about American families, and was using sophisticated psychological profiling techniques that suggested professional training or consultation with experts in behavioral manipulation. She'd even hired hackers to access email accounts and social media profiles of family members who weren't directly connected to the property dispute, gathering intelligence about extended family dynamics that she could use to identify additional pressure points. The The scope of invasion into our family's privacy was so comprehensive that it felt like being stalked by a government intelligence operation rather than a local property grabber. The financial records Mark discovered painted a picture of Claire's operation that was far larger than anyone had imagined. She wasn't just targeting individual families. She was running what appeared to be a franchise operation with other criminals in multiple states. Bank records showed regular payments from consulting clients across the western United States, all with amounts and timing that suggested she was providing her property theft techniques to other operatives. She'd essentially created a business model around destroying families, complete with training materials, standardized procedures, and performance metrics. The monthly revenue from her heritage consulting operation exceeded $200,000. Which explained how she could afford the sophisticated technology, fake experts, and legal resources that had made her so difficult to fight. But the discovery that broke Mark's moral paralysis was finding Claire's research on their next target, the Morrison family, whose patriarch had died just the previous week. Claire had already begun the digital infiltration process, creating fake social media profiles that were beginning to interact with the grieving family members, gathering intelligence about their financial situation and family dynamics. She'd even identified which family members were most likely to be decision-makers during the estate settlement process and had begun crafting fake personas designed to gain their trust. Mark realized that while we were still fighting our legal battle, Claire was already grooming her next victims, and the systematic nature of her predation made him understand that she would never stop unless someone stopped her. The evidence of Claire's digital manipulation campaign also revealed how she'd been sabotaging our support network within the community. Many of the neighbors and local officials who had seemed unsympathetic to our situation had been targeted by her fake social media campaigns, receiving carefully crafted messages designed to make them view our family negatively. She'd created false narratives about our environmental irresponsibility, planted fake stories about our family's financial problems, and even spread subtle rumors about our marriage stability, all designed to isolate us from potential allies and make community members likely to support our legal fight. The sophistication of her social engineering was like watching a master manipulator conduct a symphony of lies, with each fake account playing a specific role in her larger psychological warfare campaign. When Mark finally worked up the courage to contact us with this evidence, his voice was shaking with a combination of guilt and terror. "Gregory," he said during our secret meeting in a parking lot outside town, "what I'm about to show you proves that everything you've experienced has been planned and coordinated at a level that's beyond anything local law enforcement can handle. My wife isn't just a criminal. She's the part of an organized network that's been systematically targeting vulnerable families across multiple states." He handed me a USB drive containing copies of all the files he'd discovered. And as I scrolled through the evidence on my laptop, I felt like I was looking into the mind of a professional predator who'd made destroying families into a science. But the question that haunted me was how someone like Claire had gained access to the training, technology, and network connections necessary to operate at this level. How long has she been planning this attack on your family? Mark's revelation about Claire's long-term planning hit me like a punch to the gut. But nothing could have prepared me for what we discovered in her computer files. When Mark finally worked up the courage to show us Claire's hidden folder, labeled Palmer Family Collection, I felt like I was looking into the mind of a stalker who had been obsessing over my family for years. She had 43 separate documents spanning my grandfather Daniel's entire life: birth certificate, school records, military service papers from World War II, marriage license, property deeds, tax returns, and even personal letters he'd written to my grandmother during the war. The oldest scan was dated January 15, 2022, which meant Claire had been researching and planning her attack on our family for over 3 years. But the document that made my hands shake was a detailed timeline she'd created showing my grandfather's hospitalizations, periods of illness, and times when he would have been most vulnerable to having his signature forged without anyone noticing. The The scope of Claire's research was absolutely terrifying. She knew details about my grandfather's life that even I didn't know. She'd obtained copies of his medical records, somehow accessed his correspondence with government agencies, and even tracked down school friends from the 1940s to learn about his handwriting habits and signature evolution over the decades. Rebecca stared at the computer screen in disbelief. "Greg, this level of research would cost tens of thousands of dollars and require connections inside multiple government agencies. How does someone get access to military service records, medical files, and personal correspondence from 70 years ago?" But the most disturbing discovery was Claire's psychological profile of our family, detailing our financial situation, relationship dynamics, and what she called our litigation tolerance level. She'd calculated exactly how much legal pressure we could withstand before giving up, how long our savings would last during an extended court battle, and which family members were most likely to crack under stress. This wasn't just property theft. This was psychological warfare planned with scientific precision. The environmental angle that Claire had been pushing turned out to be the most cynical part of her entire operation. Mark showed us the real development contracts hidden in another encrypted folder on Claire's computer, and the scope of environmental destruction she was planning made me physically sick. The luxury resort development she'd secretly negotiated would clear-cut over 200 acres of old-growth forest, redirect 3 mountain streams to create artificial water features, and destroy actual endangered species habitat that she'd been claiming to protect. The resort would feature a golf course requiring massive amounts of water in an already drought-stressed area, a helipad for wealthy guests, and parking for over 500 vehicles in what was currently pristine wilderness. Claire's personal cut from this environmental disaster was $2.2 million, paid in installments as she delivered each piece of stolen property to the developers. The irony was breathtaking. She'd been using legitimate environmental concerns to justify stealing land that she planned to turn into the exact type of environmental catastrophe that real conservationists oppose. Mark's moral awakening came with serious personal costs that I hadn't fully appreciated until he explained his situation. His marriage to Claire wasn't just falling apart because of her criminal activities. It was ending because he had discovered that their entire lifestyle for the past 3 years had been funded by destroying other families. Their house payments, their cars, their vacations, even their children's college savings accounts were all built on money stolen from grieving families like mine. "Gregory," he told us during one of our secret meetings, "I've been living in a house that's literally built on other people's tears. Every night I come home, I'm reminded that the Smith family had to sell their wedding rings to pay legal fees, while my wife was using their stolen property money to remodel our kitchen, and the guilt was eating him alive." But what finally pushed him to become a full whistleblower was discovering Claire's next target, the Morrison family, whose patriarch had died just the previous week and whose memorial service was scheduled for Saturday. The pattern of Claire's victim selections was chillingly methodical. She didn't just randomly target mountain property owners. She specifically researched families during their most vulnerable moments and struck when they were least able to fight back effectively. Elderly widows were preferred targets because they often lacked the emotional energy for extended legal battles. Families dealing with multiple crises, people with limited financial resources, and anyone who demonstrated conflict avoidance in previous legal situations were marked as high-probability victims. But her most cynical targeting strategy was timing her legal attacks to coincide with memorial services, holidays, and other emotionally significant dates when families would be most distracted and least likely to mount effective resistance. She'd actually created a spreadsheet ranking potential targets by their vulnerability scores based on age, financial resources, family dynamics, and recent life stressors. The scientific coldness of turning human suffering into data points made me understand that we weren't dealing with a desperate criminal making impulsive decisions, but with someone who'd deliberately chosen to become a predator. The court case that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. FBI agents revealed the entire operation in court, with Mark's evidence, recordings, and Claire's own obsessive documentation becoming the nails in her coffin. Her network was linked to over 400 victims across 12 states, more than $30 million in stolen property, and even several suspicious deaths now being investigated as homicides. In the end, Claire's arrogance destroyed her. She documented everything, kept trophies of her crimes, and believed she was untouchable. The judge called her actions the most sophisticated elder abuse and inheritance fraud network ever prosecuted in the U.S. and sentenced her under federal racketeering charges. For my family, justice meant more than winning a case. It meant restoring my grandfather's memorial stone, honoring his legacy, and knowing our land would never be stolen again. Rebecca and I built a small memorial garden around it, and during the dedication, Jake raised a toast to stubborn families who refuse to let criminals rewrite history. That's the end of this incredible story here on Tale Time 90. If this tale of justice served and family legacy protected resonated with you, hit that like button. If this video made you say, "No way, that's real," share it with a friend and subscribe for more.